Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as we winter sow sweet pea seeds. So let's go. If you've been successful with the winter sowing process, or if you've watched a number of my how-to winter sow videos, feel free to jump to the timestamp shown below. However, if you're new to my videos or new to the winter sowing process, I highly recommend you watch the full video just so you don't miss out on some very important information. Winter sowing is the process of sowing seeds outdoors during the winter months. You can simply scatter the seeds out on the ground, or you can sow the seeds in some sort of a container or pot. When it comes to what kind of container or pot to use, there are so many different choices out there. The big thing is you want to make sure it's translucent or clear. I like to use milk jugs, but I know other people have used juice jugs, rotisserie chicken containers, totes. The possibilities are endless. The big thing is no matter what container you choose, you want to make sure that it can hold at least 4 inches of soil in it. Your containers should have holes in the top to allow water or moisture to come in. The containers should also have holes in the bottom to allow for proper drainage of water. I like to use potting mix. You can use whatever works for you. The key is to make sure that it's well draining and also that it retains some moisture. You don't want to use a seed starting mix because it's too light, too fluffy, and it will dry out way too quickly. You also don't want to use garden soil because it's very heavy and it's too compacted, which makes it difficult for roots to grow in. There are a ton of benefits when it comes to winter sowing. It's very easy to do. It's cheap. It doesn't require any additional equipment. You don't need any grow lights. You don't need any room inside your house. Another benefit to the winter sowing process is that the seeds will get a natural cold stratification period. That's very important for certain seeds such as perennial seeds. And in the end, your seedlings will be stronger, they'll be healthier, and they'll already be hardened off. You don't need to do the whole hardening off process like you would have to do if you started your plants indoors. Now there is a certain timeline that you want to follow when it comes to winter sowing. If you start your seeds too early, there is a chance that those seeds will germinate prematurely, and if you get a cold snap, some of those plants that germinate quickly can die. However, if you start your seeds too late, what will happen is certain seeds, like the ones I talked about earlier that need a certain period of cold stratification time, they might not get that full period of cold stratification that those seeds need. So timing is everything. Now, of course, when it comes to the timing, it's going to vary from location to location. A general guideline is you do your winter sowing sometime starting in the month of December, but you want to be done with it sometime about 2 to 3 weeks before your average last frost date. But I want to give you a more specific timeline that I'm going to be following and that you can follow as well. So about 5 to 6 months before your average last frost date, you want to be sowing seeds that are requiring a cold stratification period. And those are usually perennials that are hardy in your area where you live. About 3 to 4 months before your average last frost date, that's a great time to be starting cold hardy plants. Plants that can tolerate cold, but also plants that reseed very easily in your area. Approximately 1 to 2 months before your average last frost date is a good time to start plants that are not cold hardy, plants that do better in warmer temperatures. Now, keep in mind though that when those seeds germinate, if you are going to have a cold snap, if you're going to have some cold nights, cold days, you want to protect those seedlings. You may need to cover them during that time. You may need to bring in your containers just for a few nights during those cold snaps. Don't be discouraged if you're running out of containers for winter sowing. Even though there are a lot of containers you can use, I prefer to use milk jugs. In fact, one year when I didn't have that many milk jugs, I contacted a local Starbucks. I asked them if they could hold some milk jugs for me. Well, they go through so many milk jugs a day, they were more than happy to hold a few bags for me. So definitely reach out to local coffee shops if you're looking for some sort of containers that are translucent or clear. Some people like to pre-moisten their potting mix, and that is totally fine to do. The reason you won't see me doing it in my winter sowing videos is because it is frozen outside during the months of January and February. So I'm just giving a small amount of water, but then I'm placing the milk jugs outside where they're going to be frozen for a long time. And as soon as the weather warms up, I'll start watering the milk jugs more often. In order to keep your milk jugs from flying around, you can always corral them together and then put some sort of a barrier
around them just to keep them together. There are a lot of different options out there. You can use some sort of temporary fencing, you can use some sort of bricks or stones, you can be creative, but just be sure that your milk jugs are not toppling over and blowing around in the wind.
I'll start with a quick plant profile and then we'll go ahead and winter sow our sweet pea seeds. The seeds that we're going to winter sow today might be a surprise to you. They're a perennial. There are lots of annual sweet peas that are out there, but these ones are specifically a perennial version of the sweet pea plant. Also known as the everlasting pea, I actually had this plant at my last house where I lived over 20 years ago. It looked beautiful. It rambled on a fence that was on the outside of my vegetable garden. And I tried to bring that plant with me when I moved to this house. I didn't know that much about the plant. I didn't realize it had a taproot. And so most likely when I dug it up, I didn't dig it up properly, and that's why I lost the plant during the process of trying to transplant it. Perennial sweet pea has a very long, lush, trailing vines that are gorgeous, rambling over shrubs or fences, gracing an arbor, or used as a ground cover. It has vibrant rose to white pea flowers. And if you're very good about deadheading it, it'll actually bloom for you all summer long. Now, the annual version of sweet peas has a very nice fragrance to it. So the perennial version, even though it doesn't have a fragrance to it, what I like about it is that it comes back for you year after year. One thing to note is this plant is actually considered invasive in certain parts of the United States, including California as well as Oregon. It's also considered invasive in other countries like Australia. So do your research before planting this in your landscape. I did my research and I checked, and the plant is not considered invasive in New Hampshire, so I'm safe to plant it here. Here's a fun fact for you. In 1807, Thomas Jefferson planted the perennial sweet pea in one of his oval beds at his home at Monticello. The plant is hardy in USDA zones 3 through 9, and it does self-sow very readily, which is nice in case you do want to have the plant spreading in your yard. Considered to be native in Europe as well as Africa, the plant blooms from spring through the fall months. It thrives in full sun, but it will do okay in light shade, and it grows anywhere from 6 to 9 feet in height. Seeing that it has a taproot, it actually is very drought tolerant. But remember, it's not an easy plant to divide, so the best way to propagate this plant is through seed. It prefers fertile, medium moisture, well-draining soil. Perennial sweet pea makes a great cut flower. The plant is considered toxic to humans as well as pets, so you don't want to ingest any parts of it. But it is deer and rabbit resistant, which is nice if those type of pests are a problem in your yard. When it comes to sowing the seeds, you want to sow them about 1 inch deep, and the seeds do require a period of cold stratification. We'll be achieving that because we're going to be winter sowing these seeds during the month of February, so I still have plenty of time here where I live for the seeds to get that cold period that they need. However, you can cold stratify the seeds inside your refrigerator. You just want to place them in there for anywhere between 2 to 5 weeks. Due to the fact that the seeds have a very hard coat, you may want to help them along by soaking the seeds for about 1 day at room temperature. And if I was going to cold stratify the seeds in my refrigerator, I would do that. I would definitely put the seeds in a bowl of water that's room temperature for 1 day before putting the seeds in the fridge. If you're planning to sow the seeds indoors and grow them under grow lights, you want to sow the seeds about 4 to 6 weeks before your average last frost date. And if you don't know what your average last frost date is, please go to the link shown below because it will take you to a site where you enter your zip code, and that will provide you with your average last frost date. But there is also a map, and the map is a little more accurate, so find your location and then you can find the date accordingly. The seeds will germinate when the soil temperature reaches somewhere between 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. A lot of times I do like to start seeds on heat mats. This is one of those seeds that it won't help if you put it on a heat mat because it prefers a little bit of a cooler temperature. Now, my seed packet has 12 seeds in it, and I'll be running an experiment this year. I'm going to be doing the winter sowing method outdoors in milk jugs. I'm going to place 4 seeds in a milk jug where I have not soaked them, I have not nicked them. And then I'm going to place 4 seeds in a milk jug where the seeds were soaked for 24 hours. And then in the final milk jug, I'm going to be nicking the seeds, and then I'll be placing those 4 seeds in a milk jug. So be on the lookout for a future video. In the spring, I'll let you know how these seeds did given the 3 different methods. So let's go ahead and winter sow our perennial sweet pea seeds. Here are the seeds that we're going to be sowing today. And that's the information that's on the back of the seed packet, just in case you're interested. There are so many different containers you can use for winter sowing, but regardless, no matter what container you're using, always make sure it's a clean container. And you want to be sure no matter what container you're using, it can hold about 4 inches of potting soil. You can see that that goes right around here. So when I make my cut, I want to make sure I'm cutting around here, but I also need this part here. I don't want to cut into it because this will be the handle to open and close my mini greenhouse. I'm going to need something sharp to cut my mini greenhouse or my milk jug. So I'm going to be using these. You can use scissors or anything else that you have. These are just cutting shears or snips that you would use to cut tin. I threw away the cap because I want to leave this part open. Whatever container you use, you want to make sure that you have some sort of holes in the top of it to allow for water like rain or snow to come in here, and that will help keep everything nice and moist inside of your mini greenhouse. And if for whatever reason you're not getting any moisture and things are drying out, you can always add water into this hole as well. I do like to add additional holes in the top here, but that's completely optional. I've been doing it for years and that's worked for me. You also want to add drainage holes in the bottom of your container. That will allow water to come out if there's too much water in here. And it also allows it so if you want to bottom water your container, you can easily do that because then the water can wick up and it can water the soil and the seedlings that are in here. I always like to add more than less holes in the bottom because I want to make sure that this container has good drainage. And that's all I'm going to add for holes. It's a small container. If this was a much larger container, then maybe I'd add some additional holes in the center here. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut my container. Some people like to use a marker and make a line. I'm not going to worry about that. It doesn't need to be a perfect line. I'm just going to start somewhere around here and I'm going to make my way onto the other side. Now I'm going to stop because I don't want to cut all the way through. I want to have an area here and here. And the reason for that is I want to make sure that I'm using the handle as a hinge for my mini greenhouse. And notice they don't perfectly line up, and that is totally okay. Next, I'm going to go ahead and get some potting mix filled into the bottom of this container. I like to use potting mix, not seed starting mix. I find that it's better for holding the water and also it doesn't dry out as quickly. And I'm actually using potting mix that I made myself, and I'll put a link down in the description below on how to make your own potting mix. It saves a lot of money in the long run. The next thing is to push down lightly, not very hard. I'm trying to eliminate any sort of air pockets that might be in here. But I also don't want to press down too hard because as the plants start growing and their roots are forming, you want to make sure that the roots can grow inside of this potting mix. And there are the 12 seeds that were in the seed packet. So for right now, we're only going to sow 4 of the seeds, and then I'll do the special treatment with the remaining 8 seeds, and I'll sow those later on. So we want to sow the seeds 1 inch deep. That's about here on my pen. I'm just using this as a guideline, but you don't have to be exact when it comes to sowing the seeds. You just want to be approximate. And I'm going to make the 4 holes in the 4 corners because of the taproot. I want to make sure that I'm not disturbing too much of the roots when it comes time to taking the seedlings out of this milk jug. And you can just take your seed and just place it in the hole, and then once you've done that, you can just tap down or press down on the hole. And as we sow the rest of these seeds, I just want to share a little more information. Everlasting pea is known as a nitrogen fixer. That means it has the ability to convert atmospheric nitrogen into a usable form for plants through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in its own roots. And in effect, what it's doing is it's enriching the soil around its roots and all the plants that are nearby to it. And that, in effect, makes this plant a great beneficial addition to gardens with poor soil conditions. I'm just using a garden marker, and you can see I created a label, and I labeled it perennial sweet pea, and on the back it just says no treatment was given to these seeds. I always like to add labels on the inside of my containers just in case the label on the outside gets worn off. I'm just using this small hand water pump sprayer. You can use whatever you want to water your potting mix as well as your seeds. And I'm giving it just a gentle spray. I don't want to give it a very heavy spray because I don't want to dislodge any of the seeds. And remember, you may need to moisten all of your potting mix. Where I live, as soon as I bring this outside, this is going to freeze and it's going to stay frozen for days. And there will be some snow and rain that may come inside of here. But the main thing is it will be frozen. So I won't really need to add any more additional water to this, probably for the next month and a half to 2 months. I'm just using a paper towel to wipe the sides because I find it's easier to stick the duct tape onto the container if it's dry. I'm just using duct tape to seal my container shut. I know some people like to punch holes in the top as well as the bottom of their container, and then they like to close it using some sort of a twisty tie or pipe cleaner, and that seems to work well. So use whatever you want to close your container as long as you're able to easily open it on the days when it gets really hot outside, because you don't want to burn your seedlings. But then on the days that it's kind of cold and you need to protect them, you need to be able to close this. Since we're sowing perennial seeds, I'm not too worried about it getting too cold in here. And the reason is these are hardy perennials in my zone. So since I typically winter sow perennials first, December, January, and February, I only add a few pieces of the tape on my container. There's really no use in me adding tape all the way around the container because even if some cold comes in here, it's not going to kill off these perennial plants once they start germinating. They'll be fine. And they're not going to germinate anyway until the soil conditions are right, and it's usually much later into the spring season. Now, when I start winter sowing plants that are not hardy, say vegetables or annuals that are not hardy in my area, then I may need to add tape all the way around. But I'm not going to worry about it now for my perennials. I've never done this before. I've only added 2 pieces or 3 pieces of tape, and I've always had success. Pushing down, I want to make sure that the tape is sticking to my container. I'm going to use my garden marker again, and I'm just going to label what the plant is in here. I used to label it directly on the container itself, but I actually like to reuse my containers. They usually last 2 to 3 seasons. So instead, I now label it on my tape. Some people, instead of putting in the plant name on the tape, they like to number it. So they might put a number 1, and then number 1 on a piece of paper or a spreadsheet would be the plant name. So Rebecca. Number 2 might be lupin. Number 3, foxglove, and so on. And I'll just put a note on here that I did not do any treatment to these seeds. In other words, we did not nick the seeds and we did not soak the seeds. I'm going to go ahead and I'm also going to label this side of my container. That's optional. You don't have to do that. I always just do it just because. Part of the reason I do this is when it just comes to lifting up the containers, I don't have to turn it around. Then at least the label is on one side or the other side, which makes it easier. And this container can be placed outside. I'm going to put it in an area that's full sun. And notice again the cap is off because I want rain or snow to come into the hole here. And I'm going to put this with all the other containers that I have outside. The big thing is I just want to make sure that I'm protecting the containers so they don't blow around in the wind. So be on the lookout for future videos. I'll show you when the seeds have germinated, my process for pricking out the seedlings, and then putting them out in my landscape. And I'd love to hear if you're going to be winter sowing either the annual or the perennial version of sweet peas. And if you have done it in the past, what were some of your tips and secrets for pricking them out and getting them out in your landscape? Because like I mentioned, they have a taproot, so you have to be very careful not to disturb those roots during transplanting. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.